Hey there, it's me again, and today I'm back with another piece of line-drawn concept art. The client who commissioned this one essentially wanted me to design and illustrate a location from the story that he's currently working on. So that means that this one's a bit of a world-building piece, where we'll be designing an environment based off of the overall tone and some specific details that the client has provided for us within the context of the story. So essentially, the basic concept for this one is that it's a town built on top of some floating islands in the sky, and it needs to have sort of a bright and happy tone to it. And I guess it's we're not trying to be super realistic with this or anything. It needs to look like whimsical above all else, more or less, because the I think the the world that this takes place in, that this whole story takes place in, is drawn from the, or is built, I guess, upon the dreams and nightmares of children, uh, which is, pretty interesting concept, I guess. I felt like I could have a lot of fun with this after hearing that. But bearing all that in mind, this specific area is formed by daydreams, which is why it needs to look sort of bright, upbeat, whimsical, fantastical, colorful, even though we don't go into color in this, it's just a line drawing. And really other any kind of positive adjective you can think of. So, since this whole town was situated on top of a bunch of floating islands, I thought that the best way to show all of the content of the islands, because there were certain locations and certain structures and everything that the client needed to be prevalent. They're kind of like major locations or whatever in the story, that they wanted to be prevalent in the illustration and easily visible. So I decided the best place or the best way to get the most coverage out of all of these buildings and show them all the most effectively would be to do sort of a bird's eye view down. So you're looking sort of down on all the buildings, and that way, like, none of them are can be, if you're like looking at them, straight on, some of the buildings would be like hiding behind one another or whatever. It's just a good way. That perspective is just a good way to show pretty much, or show as many of the buildings and how they're laid out and everything as possible. Plus, it's really dynamic and like very neat looking when you get into doing like 3-point perspective and everything, which is what we're doing here. I find 3-point perspective is just like really visually appealing, so I tend to use it a lot, especially in situations like this where there's like cool floating islands and really fantastical elements and everything. It's super dynamic looking when everything's said and done, and it's also like really easy to kind of build things with, I guess, especially when you have like a lot of geometric structures and um, just sort of you're working with just basically a bunch of easy shapes that are all put together. Um, I guess a technique that I like to use a lot when I'm working in 3-point perspective is just treat everything as if it's a cylinder or a cube at first, or I guess a sphere or whatever, but mostly like cylinders and cubes. When we first started this, after I laid my perspective grid down, like I believe the first thing that I do was, or the first thing that I did was draw two two large cylinders and a bunch of circles, just kind of feeling around and searching out for the different forms that would eventually turn into the main shapes of the island itself. So, I mean, essentially, you're just working with a whole bunch of super basic shapes that you're putting together. And if you treat everything as if it's a cube or a cylinder or whatever, and you're following your own perspective grid that you've made for yourself, and then develop everything from those cubes or those underlying cubes, then everything is going to fall into perspective pretty much no matter what it is, unless you mess it up like really bad or something. But uh, essentially working like that is just a really good way to guarantee that everything's going to be in perspective correctly because you started with that basic shape and are using that as a guideline, which will for the most part allow everything that you're drawing to look a lot more accurate to the perspective of the piece than if you were to just do everything freehand. Now, don't get me wrong, there's like a lot of artists that can just freehand the entire thing perfectly in perspective and just come up with um, a environment just like that, like super fast at the snap of a finger without needing to build any shapes or do any sort of underlying skeleton or anything for it. But I'm personally certainly much more comfortable doing the shape skeleton first and then kind of building forms from there. So anyways, at this point we're a ways past um, building the basic shapes and forms and everything, and right now I'm going in and kind of fleshing out details and developing the shapes and everything a bit more and introducing a few consistent concepts that I kind of came up with as I was working on it. One of these was I wanted sort of spirals to be kind of a consistent theme in this. And maybe that's because I've been going through some of Junji Ito's work here recently, but I basically decided to use these spirals in this piece, and the way I wanted to do it was have these main paths that the villagers in the center are going to be using to get up to the top of these mountains. And on one mountain, there's a large structure which is an academy of magic, I think. Let me check. Hang on. Yeah, so a school of magic where mythical beings learn to perfect their craft. So that needed to be sort of like a large, I felt like castle sort of structure. And then on the other spire, I decided I didn't get any specifics for that, so I just decided to place a farm up there because I figured that spiral is it's a large flat surface and it's very exposed to like the sun and rain when it rains or whatever. So I figured, hey, that's probably where they would have a farm, right, to grow their food supply because they need one. Um, so to reach, these are both pretty important locations, and to reach them, so they'd need, some way, some sort of path or ladder or something. So I elected to go with the sort of the spiraling trail that, or spiraling staircase slash trail thing that goes like wrapping around the mountains. And I feel like having those ledges, corkscrewing around the mountains is kind of like really cool, and it adds like a sort of a unique dimension to each spire as opposed to it just being kind of a straight sort of cylinder sticking up in the air. So yeah, that's where the spirals come in. Oh, and on that small island in the back, that was meant to be sort of the home of whoever's in charge of this place, like I don't know, like what are the politics of a small floating island village, like the mayor or something, I guess. But yeah, I put some of the spirals, or yeah, some of the spirals on that as well, just sort of in the as ridges and everything on the sides of the floating island that he's sitting up on. And that's pretty much just to keep things consistent between all of the spires and the main parts of the islands, featuring those spirals and everything on them. Just kind of gives them a consistent, unique look. You know what? I guess actually thinking about like the scale of it, those that'd be like a hell of a walk to actually like walk up these staircases to get to each of these locations. Uh, I don't know how like technologically advanced the society is, but it'd probably be a much better idea to just like put some elevators or something that go up there. Either that or if this client ended up deciding that he wanted me to design sort of the race or breed or whatever of people that live up here, and they weren't, uh, they were kind of like in like a Middle Ages sort of level of technology and didn't know how to make elevators, I'd have to design them all with just like massive, just like enormous quadriceps and giant like coconut crushing thighs or whatever from all of the stair climbing that they'd have to be doing. Ooh, and they'd have to have some killer glutes. Like everyone would have to have a chiseled ass up on the floating islands. So, anyways, at this point, I've got um, most of the sketching phase is pretty much done, and everything is defined to the point where I'm ready to finalize it. So at this point, I've just made a new layer and turned the underlying sketch layer down to I think about like 25% opacity or something. And now I'm just going over it and establishing pretty much the finalized line work at this point. This is once the underlying layer will be turned off, then the final product will be what we have left. And of course, I still need to go in and do a couple sketch out like a couple of details here and there, like some of the architecture on the inner keep of the castle, I guess, and some of the details on like the rocks and everything's on the ridges of this spire that I'm working on here now. But essentially, what we're doing right now is finalizing everything and overall just like finishing the whole thing. So for this stage, I like to go in with just a hard round brush without any like opacity control or anything on it, like no pen pressure control for opacity, just a flat hard round brush. Um, and important thing that I've learned in this like recent stint of doing like a bunch of line work commissions, uh, your brush smoothing is very, very important to getting like a smooth flowing line that isn't like really jittery or anything. Um, essentially, the flow of your brush is kind of compensating. It's like making it less sensitive essentially to your hand movement, which sounds like it could be a bad thing, but what it actually ends up doing is like it's compensating um, the stroke that you're making um, or sorry, it's taking the stroke that you're making and it's compensating for any jitter or anything that you may have in your hand because these tablet pens are like really, really sensitive when the smoothing's low and it'll pick up like literally every movement that your hand will make. Um, I usually turn the smoothing up to about 50% and that allows me to get really nice smooth lines that have like a good curve to them and they'll be nice and flowing. They won't have any sort of like wiggle to them or any choppiness or anything like that. Um, the only thing that that's not good for is if you need to make like hard edges or like a really sharp like corner or something like that. Um, the smoothness, like if you have too high of a smoothness setting, it won't let you do that, but you can always just, turn it back down and back up as you need to and just kind of like play around with it and get familiar with, what level or what flow settings work for you in which situations. That's something that I'm still kind of learning because I've just started messing with brush flow, and that's just because I've all of a sudden had like a ton of these line work commissions. Usually I do like a lot of digital painting and everything, so I don't need to worry about it as much, but it's definitely the key to getting very nice, clean, smooth line work. So we've nearly finished up here. Basically, all I really have left to do at this stage is just go in um, and continue adding details and sort out like line weight and everything. If you'll notice, I like to use a lot of like thicker, darker lines in areas in areas that would be in shadow, I guess. Um, and that's a good way to give the piece a bit more depth since it's just a flat line drawing, so it could definitely use all the depth that you can give it. Um, but yeah, just like varying your lines and setting specific sort of rules for yourself like that to follow really goes a long way to sort of giving your line work a unique look, as well as adding a good amount of depth to whatever you're drawing. So for now, I'm just continuing to add detail to the cliff faces on the underlying rock that the islands are situated on top of and composed of, and and then finally we'll go up to the farm here and detail that out by putting some crops actually in the field. I have no idea what they would be growing here. I'm just gonna say like carrots and wheat. Sounds like a pretty good diet. Um, and then we'll finish these two islands up here. Still, this mayor guy has a very like modern home. It's like a cross between sort of a traditional Japanese like sloped roof or something and then like a modernist mansion. I kind of like it. But anyways, we're just getting everything nice and cleaned up for the client review. And as you can see, I just put the preview up and then sent it off to him. I don't think he had any problems with this at all. We didn't have to change anything. He was like very happy with it for the most part. So I just decided to take it a step further than I really needed to, and kind of give everything a silhouette with some value variation in order to show depth, I guess. So, just following the rule of things that are closer to the viewer or the camera or whatever are darker than things further away, and that kind of creates a certain amount of depth to the illustration. But once I was done with that, I kind of realized the background looked really empty, so I decided to just go in and add some clouds really quick. And ooh, this is kind of how I do clouds. I just make circles and then put more circles on them, and then just kind of blend the circles together or whatever. um, so those clouds get added, and then we're pretty much done at this point. So that'll be it. The client was very happy with it. I was pretty happy with it, and overall, I think it looks really good. So there you go. Thank you for watching, and see you again next time.